Hello, this is Ron Paul with your weekly update for Monday, September 22nd. Last week, the House and Senate voted to rubber stamp President Obama's war plans for the Middle East. Both bodies, on a bipartisan basis, authorized the U.S. to begin openly training and arming the rebels who have been fighting for 3 years to overthrow the Assad government in Syria. Although the Syrian government has also been fighting ISIS and related extremist groups for 3 years, the U.S. refuses to speak to the Syrians and has warned Assad not to interfere with the coming U.S. attacks on sovereign Syrian territory. President Obama promised that airstrikes alone would degrade and destroy ISIS, telling the U.S. military in a speech last week that, quote, "The American forces that have been deployed to Iraq do not and will not have a combat mission. I will not commit you and the rest of our armed forces to fighting another ground war in Iraq." But of course, any U.S. troops sent into a war zone are combat troops, and more are on their way. While the President was swearing that there would be no boots on the ground, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, was in open disagreement. General Dempsey told the Senate Armed Services Committee last week that U.S. forces would need to embed with Iraqi and Kurdish forces in combat situations under certain circumstances. The limited mission the President promised just weeks ago has already greatly escalated and now threatens to become another major regional war. In reality, however, this is just a continuation of the 24-year U.S. war on Iraq that President George Bush began in 1990 and Kennedy Obama promised to end as president. Under last week's authorization bill, the President would have authority to train 5,000 fighters in Saudi Arabia for insertion into the civil war in Syria. This is, in effect, a rearrangement of the deck chairs. To this point, the training was carried out by the CIA in Jordan and Turkey. Now, the program will be moved to the Pentagon and to Saudi Arabia. The CIA training of rebels thus far has resulted in a direct pipeline of weapons from vetted moderates to the al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra Front and to the very ISIS that the administration claims to be fighting. In July, a full brigade of 1,000 fighters from the U.S.-backed Free Syrian Army joined ISIS. Of course, they took their U.S.-provided weapons and training with them, some of which will be certainly used against the rapidly increasing U.S. military personnel in the region. That Saudi Arabia is considered a suitable place to train Syria's future leaders must be some kind of a sick joke. While ISIS was beheading 2 American journalists, as horrific as that is, the repressive Saudi theocracy was beheading dozens of its own citizens, often for relatively minor or religious crimes. If we want to stop radical terrorists from operating in Syria and Iraq, how about telling our ally Saudi Arabia to stop funding and training them? For that matter, how about the U.S. government stops arming and training the various rebel groups in Syria and finally end its 24 U.S. war on Iraq? There are 200 million people bordering the countries where ISIS is currently operating. They are the ones facing the threat of ISIS activity and expansion. Let them fight their own war rather than turning the U.S. military into the mercenary army of wealthy Gulf states. Remember, they come over here because we are over there. So let's not be over there any longer. Thanks for calling this update. A new update is placed on this number, 888-322-1414, every Sunday. The written text can be found on my Ron Paul Institute website at www.ronpaulinstitute.org and on my Facebook page. Thanks for calling.